Hello, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us today for the fourth session of the joint webinar series hosted by the Capital Area Regional Planning Commission and the Greater Madison MPO. Today's topic is environmental corridors, current requirements, and future considerations. I'm Mike Rupiper, the Deputy Agency Director and Director of Environmental Resources Planning at CARPC. We hope that these webinars will make the work we do more accessible and provide valuable opportunities for coordination and communication between our agencies and local communities. First, a few housekeeping items. All attendees are muted. Feel free to introduce yourself into the chat. Please put any questions in the Q&A. We'll be monitoring the Q&A and answer as many questions live at the end as we can. We will try to answer any quick clarifications during the presentation if possible. The presentation and a recording of this webinar will be available on the CARPC website after the event. Today's webinar will be presented by our Environmental Resources Planner, Melissa Breyer, and our GIS Specialist, Matt Noon. They will review existing requirements for environmental corridors, explain the difference between required protection areas and enhanced stewardship areas, provide information about the data sets that are used to map environmental corridors, discuss our current work related to habitat stepping stones, and share what's ahead for an update to the Environmental Corridors Report.
Thanks, Mike. Up first, I will share some background information about environmental corridors. Environmental corridors are continuous systems of open space in urban and urbanizing areas. They include lands and resources that perform important environmental functions and need to be protected from development and urbanization. Environmental corridors can provide a framework for a community-wide and area-wide open space network, which is practical, cost-effective, and capable of addressing regional community goals for preserving natural resources and controlling non-point source pollution. Wisconsin Administrative Code NR 121 outlines the delineation requirements for both areas to receive public sanitary sewer service and areas which are not intended to receive such service. According to NR 121, major areas unsuitable for the installation of waste treatment systems because of physical or environmental constraints are to be excluded from the service area. This administrative code lays out environmentally sensitive areas that are required to be delineated as environmental corridor. Areas containing wetlands, shorelands, floodways and floodplains, steep slopes, highly erodible soils and other limiting soil types, groundwater recharge areas, and other physical constraints should be considered for exclusion from the sewer service area because of the potential for adverse impacts on the quality of waters of the state from both point and non-point sources of pollution. In general, environmental corridors include major areas unsuitable for installation of water treatment systems because of their physical or environmental constraints and are to be excluded from the service area. Open space or environmental corridors have been a fundamental planning concept in Dane County since the original development and adoption of the Dane County Land Use Plan in 1973. At that time, open space or environmental corridors were mapped only in a very general fashion. Sewer service area boundaries were first delineated after the adoption of the Dane County Water Quality Plan in 1979. The task of delineating and adopting environmental corridors followed the initial task of delineating the sewer service area boundaries. The environmental corridors of the Central Urban Service Area were delineated and adopted in 1983. Corridors associated with other urban service areas in the county were completed and adopted by 1986. Environmental corridors are delineated for all urban and limited service areas in Dane County. The corridor delineation process involves compiling resource elements, applying a set of criteria for including land, and drawing the corridor boundary. The criteria applied includes the degree of contribution of an element to an environmental corridor's functions, its degree of continuity, and the degree of existing development. The adopted policies and criteria for environmental corridors in the Dane County Water Quality Plan includes a list of resource elements that are to be delineated as environmental corridor. This set of policies and criteria was adopted by the Commission and approved by the DNR. The resource features include wetlands, the 100-year floodplain, steep wooded slopes associated with water bodies, lakes, ponds, and streams, plus vegetative buffers, public lands, parks and conservancy areas, proposed public parks and conservancy areas, unique vegetation or geology, problem soils, and stormwater facilities. This table summarizes the contributions of each of the resource features to the open space functions of environmental corridors. For example, the 4 resource elements on the left side of the table fulfill the primary function of protecting water resources, drainage, and hydrologic functions. Many of the resource features provide the secondary or supplemental function of providing outdoor recreation and education opportunities. In a previous slide, I mentioned buffers. Buffer strips adjacent to wetlands and streams are provided to accommodate pollution control through the filtering of surface runoff. This figure illustrates the minimum guidelines for the provision of shoreline buffer strips. The policies and criteria for environmental corridors requires a minimum 75-foot vegetative buffer. Along navigable streams and boundaries of wetlands, a buffer strip with a minimum width of 75 feet should be provided to the landward side of the wetland or the ordinary high water mark. For intermittent streams and drainage ways that are not considered navigable, a minimum total corridor width of 75 to 100 feet is established for those corridors. In all cases, a minimum of 25-foot wide vegetative buffer strip should be provided on each side of the stream or drainage way. In addition to providing water quality functions, the purpose of a vegetative buffer is to provide wildlife protection or habitat functions. The 75-foot buffer is effective for sediment and phosphorus control, but could be less effective for nitrogen control or wildlife habitat functions, or if they are desired. A buffer distance of 100 feet to greater than 300 feet may be most effective at accomplishing a wildlife protection function. The environmental corridor dataset is continually revised, updated, and expanded with each sewer service area amendment to the Dane County Water Quality Plan. To maintain a flexible but principled administration of the environmental corridor concept, the Water Quality Plan includes provisions for changes to existing corridors. The policies and criteria for environmental corridors mentioned in previous slides, found on our website, also includes provisions for major changes and minor changes. A major change has the potential for significant adverse impacts on water quality and requires approval of the DNR after a public hearing before the Commission, a staff analysis, and the likelihood that mitigation measures will be successful. Major changes are relatively uncommon, with only 2 to 3 occurring in the last few years. This major change process generally takes 3 months. A minor or administrative mapping change does not have the potential for significant adverse impacts on water quality and does not require a public hearing or DNR approval, but it is reviewed by the RPC staff. Minor changes are fairly common as part of the platting and sewer extension processes. Next, I'll turn it over to Matt, who is going to share information about environmental corridor amendments and acres of environmental corridor that have been added in the last 10 years.
Thanks, Melissa. So this table shows the number of sewer service area amendments and the amount of environmental corridor acres that have been added over the last 10 years, split up by 2 different time periods. In total, in Dane County, we have 38 different sewer service areas. 22 of those are urban service areas, and 16 of them are limited service areas. on average, there's about 5 sewer service area amendments added every single year. And in the last 10 years, all of the sewer service area amendments that have been added are in one of these 14 service areas in this table here. And so you can see between 2010 and 2011 and 2015, the majority of the sewer service area amendments were added in the central service area, and in addition to the majority of the acres being added into the central service area as well. And then you can see in the northern service area, there were also 3 sewer service area amendments added, but there's also a significant amount, 328 acres of environmental corridor added during that time period. And then between 2016 and 2020, you can see, again, the central service area had the most sewer service area amendments added, in addition to the most acres added with 202 acres. And then the second most service area with sewer service area amendments added was Cottage Grove. And then in this next map, you can see that clearly the central service area is much larger and includes other municipalities aside from Madison, such as Middleton, Fitchburg, McFarland. So it's not that surprising that there's significantly more service areas service areas added to the central service area. But you can also see that between 2011 and 2015, the majority of those sewer service area amendments added were on the west side of Madison or in Fitchburg area. And then you can also clearly see between 2016 and 2020 that there were quite a few amendments or amendment areas added in Verona, Cottage Grove, and also on the west side of Madison.
Thanks, Matt. Potential future environmental corridors are a useful tool for the comprehensive planning of future urban development and natural resource preservation. They were first mapped in 2019 and are used to assist communities in identifying areas outside of current urban service area boundaries that will likely be required or recommended to be considered as environmental corridors in the future. This effort resulted in the mapping of future environmental corridors into 2 categories: protection areas and stewardship areas. Protection areas will be required to be mapped as environmental corridors if and when those areas are added to an urban service area. Stewardship areas are advisory areas to consider for inclusion from a stewardship or planning standpoint to enhance the environmental corridor dataset. The mapped potential future environmental corridors can identify areas for use in comprehensive and neighborhood plans. Future environmental corridors have been evaluated for the entire region. This effort relates to one discussed in our June webinar. Over the last several years, CARPC worked with local communities, stakeholders, and the public to identify priorities for managing regional population and business growth. The outcome of this work is the Regional Development Framework, a guide for local communities and regional partners with strategies to achieve shared regional goals. One of the 3 goals of the framework is to foster regional development that conserves water resources and natural areas. The framework strategy to achieve this goal is to avoid protected areas and enhance stewardship areas. So these resources we are discussing today are a key tool for implementing the Regional Development Framework. This category of future environmental corridor was delineated following the elements and criteria outlined in the environmental corridors policies and criteria discussed earlier. They include a 1% annual chance flood area, mapped or delineated wetlands, lakes and open water, perennial streams, intermittent streams and drainage ways and their associated buffer, riparian steep slopes, native prairie and savanna remnants, existing parks or public natural areas, and existing stormwater management facilities. Stewardship areas include additional lands and resources that should be stewarded as urban development expands. Stewardship areas are considered good recommendations for corridors, but are not required and include 0.2% annual chance flood area, potentially restorable wetlands, internally drained areas, hydric soils, the current or potential ice age trail corridor, natural resource area boundaries, connecting corridors, and high-quality woodlands. Connecting corridors and high-quality woodlands are two items currently under development. We will discuss connecting corridors later in this webinar. Next, Matt will provide information and mapping examples of the data sets included in the potential future environmental corridors, as well as information about our open data portal.
Thanks, Melissa. So here we'll review the components and sources of the protection and stewardship areas. So here you can see the open water with the 75-foot buffer, intermittent streams 50-foot buffer, and the perennial streams with a 100-foot buffer. The source from this data set is DNR hydro. These are all protection area layers. Next, you can see savanna areas. That was mapped through the Dane County. Riparian steep slopes, that was mapped by CARPC using elevation data, and the parks data set, which is a combination of Dane County and municipal managed park lands, in addition to DNR managed lands. These are all also protection area components. And here you have stormwater management areas, also part of the protection areas. This is from the 2015 land use inventory. Right now, CARPC is working with the Dane County and the city of Madison to update every 5 years a land use inventory. So the next land use inventory will be 2020, which have almost completed. And we put a lot more emphasis this go around into mapping stormwater management facilities. So we think that this particular area will have a greater impact on protection areas soon as it gets updated. And here you have the wetlands with a 75-foot buffer. That's from the DNR wetland inventory. Hydric soils is from the NRCS Surgo data set, and potentially restorable wetlands from the DNR. So the wetlands and the hydric soil, or the wetlands, are part of the protection area layer, and the hydric soils and the potentially restorable wetlands are stewardship area layers. And here we have the 100-year and 500-year flood zones from FEMA, where the 1% and 0.2% flood zones. The 100-year 0.1% flood zone is a protection area, and the 0.2% year flood zone is the stewardship area. We've also mapped out internally drained areas from 2017 elevation data sets at CARPC. That's part of the stewardship area. And then finally, the last two components of the stewardship area can include the Ice Age Trail and the natural resource area boundary data set, which is managed by Dane County, which includes lands that the Dane County has identified for prioritization for conservation efforts. And so next we're gonna take a look at our open data portal at CARPC. I encourage everyone to check it out when they get some chance, or when they get a chance. So at CARPC, we manage a few data sets, such as the sewer service area boundaries, a sewer service area amendment web map, environmental corridors, now future environmental corridors, culvert data, canopy cover data, in addition to a few historical land cover data sets as well. So this is what our open data portal looks like at CARPC. On the top half portion of our open data portal are web maps that we manage and maintain. And then on the bottom half here are data sets that are used within our web maps that are available for download. So right now we're just going to go look at our future potential environmental corridor web map. After this, we can check out, or show you how we can go about downloading the data sets. So here are all the protection areas and stewardship areas mapped outside of the urban service area. And we'll just zoom in to give you an example of how this works. So if you click on a polygon, right here, you can see this polygon where the mouse is obviously a protection area and a stewardship area. So if we click on it, at first it will show you, okay, why it's a protection area. And so this polygon here is only listed as a protection area because it's in the 0.1 or 100-year flood zone. If there was more than one reason why it's a protection area, then it would be listed here as well. And then if you click on this little arrow here, it will show you the reasons why it's a stewardship area. And so this polygon, the stewardship area polygon, is mapped because it's a potentially restorable wetland, and it's also labeled as a hydric soil. And so one other function of this map is if you wanted to look at individual criteria that compose the protection areas or stewardship areas, you can turn on or off individual layers. So right here, we're looking at only the savannas that have been mapped. Or now we're only looking at the protection areas of riparian steep slopes. And here are the internally drained areas, the stewardship area, and so forth. So we've only recently put this map out to the public, and we've made a few different changes to it. So we're always open for suggestions and looking for ways to improve it or to make it more friendly to the user. So if you have any comments about it, please reach out to one of us or me. So now we're back to the CARPC open data portal. We'll just go over quickly how you can download the data. So as I said before, you scroll down to the bottom half of the web page, and here is the future environmental corridor data set. And to download the GIS data, you have to click on whether you want to download the protection areas or the stewardship areas. Say we want to download the protection areas. You click on this little cloud button here, download. And then it gives you an option if you want to download a spreadsheet of all the data, you can download a CSV, or you want to download a file for Google Earth or KML, or you can get a shapefile that works in any GIS platform or GeoJSON as well. So I think that's it for the demo. I'll turn it back over to you, Melissa.
Thanks, Matt. So I mentioned connecting corridors earlier. We are currently evaluating habitat stepping stones as a way to connect environmental corridors in the region. This figure on the right, created by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, provides a great visual example of what habitat stepping stones are. Habitat stepping stones can provide connections between habitat patches where linear corridors are not available. The goal of this effort is to create broader corridors and/or habitat stepping stones between corridors that can be added as stewardship areas to the future environmental corridor dataset as a way to enhance the wildlife protection function of environmental corridors. Habitat stepping stones can provide necessary connections to then serve as continuous open space corridors. As with the other data sets included in the future environmental corridor mapping, the entire Dane County region was evaluated. In 2012, CARPC did some work related to regional planning for ecology and habitat. 5 models were used, including a stepping stone model that evaluated where to place smaller patches to link networks. 16 species found within Dane County that are sensitive to fragmentation and movement through non-habitat were selected for the modeling. The selected species can be considered complementary umbrella species. Umbrella species are species that have either large habitat needs or other requirements whose conservation results in many other species being conserved at the ecosystem or landscape level. To model the 16 species, buffers were created for their home patches in sites were excluded within a 1 to 4 distance of the home patch to create a donut as shown in the light green on the figure. Stepping stones start at a 50% dispersal distance and end at a 100% dispersal distance. The model maps the position of the stepping stone, but not the size. The size is shown as a percentage of the home patch. The following factors or data sets were used to delineate potential habitat stepping stones. An area's resilience score, its land cover type, the position of the species stepping stone, and the size of a patch. The Nature Conservancy Resilient Land Mapping Tool maps resilient sites for terrestrial conservation. Some core concepts of this are that it defines a resilient site as an area where high microclimate diversity and low levels of human modification provide species with the connected, diverse climatic condition they will need to persist and adapt to changing regional climates. A site's resilience score estimates its capacity to maintain species diversity and ecological function as the climate changes. It was determined by evaluating and quantifying physical characteristics that foster resilience, particularly the site's landscape diversity and local connectedness. Overall goal of the Nature Conservancy effort was to identify places more resilient to climate change for each geophysical setting within each ecoregion. So as part of a factor to delineate the potential habitat stepping stones, areas that are more resilient, so they have a far above average score of 10, or more resilient and are considered above average and have a score of 5. For this mapping effort, sites with the highest resilience score are found in northwestern Dane County. The WISC Land 2.0 dataset from 2016 was developed through a collaborative effort by Wisconsin DNR, UW-Madison, and the Wisconsin State Cartographer's Office. Level 1 is considered the most generalized level of land cover, with each successive levels 2 through 4, adding a higher level of detail to the class. Not every class is subdivided down to level 4. For the purposes of this effort, levels 1, 2, and 3 were evaluated. Areas within Dane County that fall within the level 1 classification of grassland, forest, open water, wetland, barren, and shrubland were considered. Habitat for the selected species may be found within these land cover types. And as a whole, this grouping comprises 39% of the land cover in Dane County. The agricultural land cover class was excluded and just due to the likelihood of increased disturbance, and it makes up almost 47 or almost half of the land cover of the county. And then approximately 30% is grassland or forest. Much of the wetland or open water land cover types fall within the protection area category already with the future potential environmental corridors. I have an example here for grasslands. As I said, some of the classes aren't broken down to level 4, and some contain many subdivisions under levels 2 and 3. Here I've provided a less complex example. So of the 15.17% that's classified under level 1 as grassland, approximately 10% would be considered more suitable for sustained wildlife habitat. Hay is managed more than the other subdivided classes under level 3 grassland. It would could only be suitable for portions of the year. Here are the 16 rodent and amphibian species that were used in the habitat stepping stone model in 2012. They include 7 rodent species, within that chipmunk, shrew, voles, and mice, and 9 amphibian species, frogs, toads, salamanders, and a newt. The state of Oregon's Metro put together the Wildlife Corridor and Permeability Report in 2010 to review the science of how and why wildlife species need to move across a landscape, including suggested methods to map and improve connectivity. This literature review describes a study conducted at Portland State University that indicates that small mammals may only need habitat patches of about 25 acres or 10 hectares or greater. This study also concluded that 30 acres or 12 hectares seems to be an appropriate starting point for large habitat patches. Several other studies scattered throughout a variety of forested regions indicate that 25 to 30 acres, the 10 to 12 hectares, may constitute a significant patch threshold for some species. For the purposes of this mapping effort, 10 hectares was selected for a minimum patch size. Here is an example of what this would look like on the map. So this potential habitat stepping stone could provide a connection between the nearby protection and stewardship areas. This example shows an area with central hardwoods, pine, and pasture level 3 land cover types that is over 10 hectares in size, has resiliency scores that are more and most resilient, and contains overlapping stepping stone positions for multiple modeled species. We are currently in the process of using ranking criteria to select areas with the highest potential to serve as stepping stone connectors between corridors. Factors considered when ranking the suitability of these potential stepping stones include distance to nearest mapped potential stepping stone, park and/or areas already mapped as future environmental corridor, barriers like busy roads, or in the case of amphibians, large patches of dry land, the number of overlapping species stepping stones, a site's resiliency, and the level 3 land cover type. So what's next? Well, the completion of the ranking process for the potential habitat stepping stones is anticipated for September of this year. We would next like to evaluate high quality woodlands as stewardship areas. Additionally, the environmental corridors report needs to be updated to add the recommended stewardship areas. It was last updated in 1996. This update process will involve forming a steering committee or technical advisory committee and is anticipated for 2022. If anyone is interested in participating in this, please let me know. My email address will be provided at the end of this presentation as well as Matt's. The environmental corridor related documents mentioned in this presentation can be found on our website under the environmental corridor tab within the environmental resources page. We will answer any questions from the Q&A list as time allows, as many questions from the Q&A list as time allows. If you have further questions or would like to discuss future environmental corridors further, please reach out to Matt or I via email.
Thanks, Melissa and Matt. Great job. We do have a number of questions in the chat, so we'll go through and answer those. As a reminder, if you do have a question you want to ask us now, please feel to type it into the chat. So our first question is from Adam Christensen. It was modified a little bit. What's the difference between protection areas and stewardship areas? I know you covered that a little bit, Melissa, but maybe go over it again. It is kind of a new concept in the corridors.
Yeah, so the areas that are within the urban service areas that are required to be mapped as environmental corridor, those the same concept behind why those are required, it would apply if an area is to be added to urban service area. So we consider the protection areas, the areas that are going to be required to be mapped as environmental corridors in the amendment process. And then the stewardship areas are areas that would, build off of or enhance those protection corridors. So they have the elements that we mentioned and would just serve to enhance water quality and wildlife and just natural areas in general.
So just to kind of summarize in simple terms, the protection areas are areas that are currently required to be an environmental corridor, either under NR 121 or under the adopted policies and criteria for environmental corridors in the water quality plan for this region. And stewardship areas are areas that we're suggesting people look at as potential enhancements, additions to the environmental corridor that would be on a voluntary and non-required basis. So Adam also had kind of a follow-up question to that, or a second part, is do the stewardship areas have legal protection from development? And I guess the answer would be stewardship areas that are voluntarily placed in environmental corridors would have some protection because it would be reviewed during the development process. But they are voluntary, and so there's not a requirement for stewardship areas to be placed in environmental corridors. We have another question from an anonymous attendee. Is CARPC actively recruiting more land for corridors? And does CARPC need to actually purchase the land, or can it stay in the original ownership? Maybe I'll just field that question. So I wouldn't say we're actively recruiting more land for corridors per se, but we obviously are suggesting some recommendations with the stewardship areas for some additional areas for people to look at, communities to look at, landowners to look at and consider when delineating environmental corridors that could add additional land to the corridor beyond what's currently required. And as far as land ownership, CARPC does not own any land in the region. We don't own the environmental corridors. Environmental corridors are typically either owned by the original landowner, or oftentimes these areas are put into public outlots and things like that that are then owned and maintained by the local municipalities. But CARPC does not own any of the environmental corridor land. Next question from Tom Matthews. Is there enforcement authority to protect environmental corridors? For example, if development were to be proposed within an environmental corridor, then how would that environmental corridor be protected? Probably best if I take that question too. So environmental corridors are reviewed as part of the development process. So as part of the sewer service area review, as part of plan review by the local communities. So once the area is placed in environmental corridor as part of a USA amendment and sewer service area delineation, CARPC reviews those development plans when they come in then for sewer service, and we check to make sure that areas that are required to be placed in environmental corridors are not receiving any sewer development. And the local communities do likewise as part of their plan review process. We have another question again from an anonymous attendee. Where do we find actual resolutions that are approved? Assume you're referring to the resolution that approved the current policies and criteria that were adopted in 2008 for environmental corridors. I don't know that we have an actual link to that resolution on our website, but we do have a link to the policies and criteria themselves. And that's on the environmental corridor page of our website that Melissa showed earlier here. So feel free to follow up with Melissa or I directly if you want the actual resolution that approved the environmental corridors as policies and criteria in 2008, and we can provide that to you as well as the DNR approval letter, because everything that we approve as far as urban service area amendments or environmental corridors has to ultimately be approved by DNR as part of the water quality plan for the region. Next, we got a question from Brian Standing, Dane County Planning. Can you explain how the stewardship categories will be implemented if they're not required as part of an urban service area expansion? Melissa, do you want to comment on that first, or do you want me to take that?
If you could take that, please. I might follow up with Brian later with my thoughts.
Yeah, so the stewardship areas, like we said, we're putting this out here as kind of in conjunction with the regional development framework, with the intention that communities can use this primarily as they're developing their comprehensive plans and neighborhood plans. So they're looking at these areas, again, beyond what would be required as corridor, but some of these areas are going to make sense, for a variety of reasons to include in as corridor 2 potentially. So we're kind of putting the information out there so people have access to it and can kind of think through that process as primarily as part of their comprehensive plan and neighborhood planning process. A question from Lance Green: do any protection or stewardship areas exist in the central area? So as was kind of touched on in the presentation, environmental corridors have been already delineated for all of the existing urban service area. So that includes the central urban service area. So those are all mapped as part of the mapping that's available on our website. Question from Greg Fries at City of Madison: are the resolutions linked to the e-ways on your GIS? Often the resolution has specific information that I need to see. Currently, what we have available through our open data portal is a link to the resolutions and related documents for each urban service area amendment. So not to each particular environmental corridor. So you'd have to kind of go to the urban service area amendment area itself. But you should be able to find that through our open data portal. And if there's ever one that you can't find, there's some of the older historical information we don't have on there yet, at least all of the documentations. You would just obviously reach out to our staff and we'll connect you with those or update what's available through the open data portal as necessary. Another question from Brian Standing: has there been consideration of adding things like the 0.2% floodplain or hydric soils to the required protection categories to address increased rainfall anticipated as a result of climate change? I guess my answer would be, for now, we're proposing it as stewardship areas, obviously. I think we want to see what kind of reception and interest there is to including some of these areas. To change them from a advisory optional stewardship area to a protection category would require either a change to DNR's administrative code for water quality planning, or it would require a change to the policies and criteria for environmental corridors that would be approved by the commission and DNR as well. So, I know the county tried to get the 0.2% floodplain adopted at one time, and there was a lot of pushback against that. I don't see this going to a requirement at this point in time. I don't know that there's support for that, but we want to start having conversations with people about it as a voluntary basis for consideration as part of these stewardship areas first. And a question for Tom Matthews: are all steep slopes considered for environmental corridors or only riparian steep slopes? The current policy and criteria is that only riparian steep slopes are required as environmental corridor. Obviously, all steep slopes could be considered for environmental corridor as more of a stewardship area, but the requirement currently is just riparian steep slopes. And a question from Rick Eilertson: sometimes developers and/or communities incorporate public land dedication adjacent to existing defined environmental corridors that has similar environmental qualities. Is there any benefit to the developer and/or community to formally add those areas into the environmental corridor mapping? Yeah, typically, if there's park or green space, it is added into the environmental corridor. If it's put in an open public outlet or something like that. If it's not a required environmental corridor, it can still be placed in environmental corridor. One of the benefits of that from a, I guess, economic standpoint is that, at least in the Madison Metropolitan Sewer District area, they do not charge connection fees for lands that are officially in environmental corridors. So that could be one benefit to putting some of these areas, even some of what we're calling the stewardship areas into environmental corridor, if at least you're in the MMSD service area for sewer service. So that's all of the questions that we had in our Q&A. It looks like maybe there's one question in the chat here. What kinds of skills or expertise are you seeking for volunteers for the environmental corridor update project? I would say for the steering committee, advisory committee that we're going to have for the corridor report, we're looking for, this question came from Cynthia Richson at the town of Middleton. So, we're looking for a local community perspective. So if you're city, village, town staff, or elected official, we'd welcome your participation. If you have a background in environmental resources or something, that's certainly beneficial too. But we want to have a diverse group of people that are just basically interested in the topic to provide us feedback on the plan update. So if you're interested at all, definitely reach out to Melissa or myself and let us know. And like she mentioned, we hope to start that work in 2022, but we wanted to complete the mapping and have Melissa, complete more of the stepping stone work and stuff like that. So we have some material to really go through and talk about together when we do have a technical advisory committee on it. But the intent is to update the report then for corridors. So we have an actual document that people can refer to that explains the rationale for primarily why we're, suggesting consideration of some of these stewardship areas, as well as other updates that we might make to the environmental corridors report.
Well, if we don't have any other questions, thank you for joining us today for the 4th webinar of the 2021 RPC-MPO joint webinar series. The recording and presentation slides for this webinar will be available on our website. Please join us on October 21st for a webinar on the economics of green infrastructure, also presented by CARPC. Have a great rest of your day.